Guts was not born into a cradle. He was not welcomed by warm hands or whispered into existence beneath a roof that kept the rain away. His first ceiling was open sky, gray, indifferent, vast. His first lullaby was the wind moving through ropes tied to the necks of the dead. He entered the world beneath a hanging corpse, cut from the womb of a woman who had already lost her life before he could take his first breath. The battlefield had not yet cooled. The mud was thick with blood, thick with footprints, thick with the final imprints of men who had died believing they would see another sunrise. And in the middle of that aftermath, that discarded, exhausted patch of earth, a child cried loud enough to declare himself alive. There is something deeply unsettling about that image, and not merely because it is grotesque. It feels symbolic in a way that transcends shock. To be born from a corpse is to begin life already entangled with death. It is to skip innocence entirely and arrive directly in the shadow of finality. Most people begin their lives protected from the awareness of mortality. Guts began suspended beneath it. The body of his mother swayed above him, a silent monument to the cost of existence in a world ruled by steel and hunger. Before he could understand language, before he could form memory, the world had already defined him through absence. He did not lose a mother later in life. He never had one to lose. The mercenaries who found him did not arrive as saviors. They were not moved by destiny or prophecy. They were men hardened by necessity, scavengers of war who understood that life and death were simply two currencies constantly being exchanged. When they discovered the crying infant beneath the gallows tree, it was not awe that crossed their faces. It was superstition, confusion, unease. A child born from a hanged woman in a world already steeped in cruelty felt like an omen rather than a blessing. And perhaps it was, because Guts's life would not unfold gently. It would not be spared. It would not soften with time. Only one among them, a woman named Shisu, chose to see something beyond the omen. She took him in, despite the murmurs, despite the uneasy glances, despite the sense that this child had emerged from something unnatural. In her arms, for a brief flicker of time, Guts experienced warmth that did not demand anything from him. He was not yet a soldier, not yet a tool, not yet a weapon. He was simply a fragile thing that required care. And that short-lived mercy matters more than it seems, because it becomes the only reference point for gentleness in his earliest years. Shisu's kindness is not grand or dramatic. It is small. It is human. And it is temporary, because the world that allowed him to survive did not intend to shelter him. Shisu was already ill when she found him. Her body, like so many others in that camp, was failing under the weight of a brutal existence. When she died, Guts lost the only figure who had offered him something resembling unconditional care. He was too young to process grief in words, But loss does not require vocabulary to imprint itself. Loss becomes atmosphere. It becomes expectation. It becomes the quiet understanding that anything soft will vanish. From that moment forward, the mercenary camp was not a place of protection. It was an environment of conditioning. Children in most worlds learn through play. Guts learned through proximity to violence. He learned to sleep through the sounds of sharpening blades. He learned that raised voices did not always signal anger. Sometimes they signaled battle. He learned that food was not guaranteed, that stability was an illusion, that the world outside the campfire's glow was waiting to take something from you if you were not prepared to defend it. And at the center of that environment stood Gambino. Gambino was not a caricature of evil. He was something more mundane and, in many ways, more tragic. A man carved hollow by war, who understood survival as transaction. To him, guts was an inconvenience that had to justify its presence. A child required feeding. A child required resources. And resources were scarce. The only way to earn space in a mercenary band was through usefulness. So, usefulness became the lens through which guts was seen. Not as a son, not as a miracle, not even as a burden to be cherished, but as potential labor. This is where the psychological foundation of Guts' suffering begins to crystallize. He grows up internalizing a simple equation. You are allowed to exist if you are strong enough to survive. Affection is conditional. Belonging is conditional. Even protection is conditional. The world does not grant value freely. You must prove it, blade in hand. And yet, even before he can lift a sword properly, even before he understands what strength means, he has already proven something extraordinary. He lived. Against the statistical cruelty of his circumstances, against the indifference of a battlefield that consumes without hesitation, he survived infancy. That survival is not framed as divine blessing. It is framed as resistance, as though his existence itself is an act of defiance against a world that would have preferred silence. That defiance becomes the undercurrent of his entire life. The image of his birth lingers because it refuses to soften. A child cut from a corpse beneath a hanging tree is not meant to symbolize hope in any traditional sense. It symbolizes confrontation. Guts does not arrive into a world that promises redemption. He arrives into a world that promises hardship. And yet, he breathes anyway. He cries anyway. He persists anyway. Before the band of the hawk, before Griffith's dream reshapes his understanding of ambition, before Casca becomes warmth in a life defined by cold, before the Eclipse tears apart everything that dares to resemble happiness, there is this: a newborn lying in mud, overlooked by the dead, unclaimed by destiny, unwanted by superstition, and still alive. Suffering did not enter Guts' life later. It was the climate of his first breath. Most stories begin with potential. Guts' story begins with endurance. And endurance, unlike glory, does not glitter. It does not inspire cheers. It does not announce itself with triumph. It is quiet. It is stubborn. It is the decision to keep breathing when breathing itself feels like rebellion. From the moment he entered the world, Guts was not marked for greatness in the romantic sense. He was marked for survival. And survival, in a world like Berserk's, is the cruelest blessing of all. If Guts's birth was an act of affiance against death, then his childhood was the world's answer to that defiance. There was no gradual easing into hardship, no soft buffer between infancy and brutality. The mercenary camp did not adjust itself around him. It absorbed him. As soon as he was old enough to stand steadily, he was expected to understand the rhythms of survival. Men around him gambled, drank, sharpened steel, and spoke casually about killing as if it were weather. Violence was not spectacle in this world. It was currency. It was employment. It was routine. And children in such an environment do not get to remain children for long. Gambino raised him the only way he knew how, harshly, practically, without patience for fragility. There was no language of comfort, no encouragement shaped around dreams. Gambino saw the world as something that punished weakness immediately and without remorse. In his mind, the cruelest thing he could do to Guts was not strike him. It was allow him to remain soft. So discipline became severity. Instruction became intimidation. Approval, when it appeared at all, was thin and fleeting. For Guts, affection became something to earn through competence. He trained with weapons before he could fully understand the weight of what those weapons were for. The sword was too large for his small hands at first, but that did not matter. It would become an extension of him soon enough. There is a quiet tragedy in the image of a child learning balance, not through play, but through steel. Learning coordination, not through games, but through repetition of lethal motion. His muscles developed around violence. His reflexes formed around threat. And then, at 9 years old, he was brought to a battlefield not as a bystander, but as a participant. Most children at that age are just beginning to grasp the shape of the world. Guts was asked to pierce it. The first man he killed was not a monster, not a demon, not an apostle, just another soldier, frightened, human, trying to survive his own set of circumstances. There is something profoundly destabilizing about that moment. A child standing over a body he has just ended. No ceremony. No recognition of the enormity of what has occurred. Just the expectation that he will keep moving. And he does, because stopping would mean falling behind. And falling behind in a mercenary band means being left. It is important to understand how this shapes him. When your first formative achievement is taking a life, your internal compass shifts. Guts does not celebrate. He does not recoil dramatically. He internalizes. He absorbs. He learns that survival requires detachment. That hesitation invites death. That mercy is a luxury the battlefield does not respect. But the deepest fracture of his childhood does not come from war. It comes from betrayal. Donovan. The name itself lingers like something sour in the air. Gambino, desperate for coin, sold Guts' body to another mercenary for a night. There is no justification that makes this smaller. No context that softens it. It was a transaction. The child who had fought for the band. The child who had proven useful. The child who sought Gambino's approval. Reduced to currency. What makes this wound so corrosive is not only the violation itself, but who enabled it. Gambino did not simply fail to protect him. He orchestrated it for money, for drink, for temporary relief from his own bitterness. In that moment, whatever fragile structure of trust Guts had built around the concept of fatherhood collapsed. A child can survive brutality from the world more easily than betrayal from the person meant to anchor him. Afterward, something in Guts calcifies. You can feel it in the way he carries himself, in the way he stops seeking approval with the same open vulnerability. He does not articulate this change. He does not confront it with language, but he internalizes a lesson that will follow him into adulthood. Trust is dangerous. Attachment is leverage. Dependence invites exploitation. When he kills Donovan later, it is not triumphant. It is not cathartic in the heroic sense. It is desperate, defensive, a reclaiming of bodily autonomy through force because no other avenue was available to him. And even then, the act does not restore innocence. It simply reinforces the pattern, pain answered by violence. Gambino's reaction to Donovan's death is not relief. It is accusation, blame. He turns on Guts, fueled by grief over Shisu, by bitterness over his own injuries, by superstition about Guts' cursed birth. He calls him bad luck, a demon child, a bringer of misfortune. It is easier for Gambino to project his failures onto Guts than to confront them within himself. Imagine being a child who was born beneath a corpse, who fought in wars before understanding morality, who was sold for coin, who defended himself, and then being told that you are the curse. There is a psychological violence in that accusation that cuts deeper than any blade. Because children believe what they are told about themselves. If the world repeatedly signals that your existence brings suffering, you begin to internalize that narrative. You begin to anticipate abandonment, to expect hostility, to assume that survival requires emotional distance. Guts' childhood is not just traumatic in events. It is traumatic in messaging. The message is consistent. You are alone. You are expendable. You must rely only on yourself. And yet, even under that crushing weight, he does not break in the way the world expects him to. He grows stronger, not because he wants to, not because he dreams of glory, but because strength is the only language the world around him respects. If he cannot secure love, he will secure competence. If he cannot secure protection, he will become formidable enough that harming him requires effort. By the time his childhood ends, if it can even be called a childhood, Guts has already lived through experiences that would fracture most adults. He has killed. He has been betrayed. He has been labeled cursed. He has learned that intimacy can be weaponized. And yet, beneath all of that, there remains something stubbornly alive within him. Not hope, not optimism, but refusal. Refusal to die quietly. Refusal to submit completely. Refusal to vanish the way the world seemed to expect he would the night he was born. His suffering in these early years does not make him noble. It does not elevate him. It hardens him. It forges him into something that resembles survival instinct more than childhood. The sword becomes less a weapon and more a boundary, a line drawn between him and everything that seeks to reduce him to nothing. By the time he raises that sword against Gambino, by the time blood ties sever permanently, the final thread of childhood snaps. He will not be a son. He will not be protected. He will not be spared. He will walk forward alone. And in that solitude, his suffering will deepen. But so will his will. The night Guts killed Gambino was not a triumphant rebellion. It was not the clean break of a hero stepping into independence. It was chaotic, rain-soaked, desperate, a collision of grief, alcohol, resentment, and accumulated pain finally spilling over into violence. Gambino, drunk and hollowed out by his own failures, staggered into Guts's tent with a blade and accusations. He called him cursed, called him a demon child, blamed him for Shisu's death, blamed him for his own maimed leg, blamed him for misfortune that had been brewing long before Guts ever drew breath. And perhaps that is what hurt most, the way Gambino reshaped history to make Guts the origin of all suffering around him. Children carry guilt easily. They internalize blame with frightening efficiency. For years, Guts had tried to earn Gambino's approval the only way he understood how. Through strength, through usefulness, through proving that he deserved space in the band. And now, in one drunken storm of bitterness, Gambino erased all of it, reduced him to an omen, a mistake, a curse. When Gambino lunged, Guts reacted, not as a son, as a soldier. The blade that had once felt too heavy for his hands moved with reflex. The training that had replaced play took over. The survival instinct that had been drilled into him since infancy answered before emotion could. And when the moment ended, Gambino lay bleeding in the mud, rain washing over his body, the same way it had washed over countless others on countless battlefields. But this death was different. This one was personal. Guts did not scream in horror. He did not collapse. He stood there, soaked, breathing hard, staring at the body of the man who had been the closest thing he had to family. And in that silence, something inside him shifted permanently. Killing on the battlefield had been survival. This felt like exile. He had not only lost a father, he had become the man who killed him. The mercenary band did not pause to weigh context. They saw a boy standing over Gambino's corpse and made a simple calculation. Threat, betrayal, liability. And so they turned on him. Torches lit, blades drawn, shouts cutting through the rain. The same men who had watched him grow now hunted him. There was no trial, no attempt at understanding. In their world, loyalty was simple, and death was final. And so, Guts ran. He ran not just from swords, but from the last fragile thread tying him to belonging. The campfires behind him flickered smaller as he disappeared into darkness, into forest, into uncertainty. He did not look back, not because he felt nothing, but because looking back would slow him down. And slowing down meant dying. This is the true beginning of his isolation. Before this night, even in cruelty, he had existed within structure. There had been a camp, a hierarchy, a routine. Brutal, yes, but familiar. Now there was nothing. No group, no guardian, no direction. Just a sword on his back and the understanding that survival would depend entirely on him. There is a particular loneliness that comes from being rejected by the only world you've known. It is not dramatic at first. It is practical, immediate. You find food. You find shelter. You avoid roads where mercenaries might recognize you. But beneath that practical survival hums something deeper, the realization that you are unmoored, that if you fall, no one will catch you. If you are wounded, no one will tend to you. If you disappear, no one will come looking. For Guts, this does not immediately manifest as sorrow. It manifests as resolve. If belonging can vanish overnight, then perhaps it was never stable to begin with. If fatherhood can turn into accusation, then perhaps reliance is a weakness. If community can shift into mob within minutes, then perhaps solitude is safer. These conclusions do not form as philosophical statements in his mind. They embed themselves instinctively. They shape how he carries himself, how he speaks, how little he speaks. They are reinforced every time he enters a new mercenary group temporarily, fights for coin, and leaves before attachment can form. In these wandering years, Guts becomes efficient at departure. He joins. He fights. He collects payment. He moves on. No roots. No expectations. No vulnerability. The sword grows heavier as he grows stronger. His body stretches into adolescence under the constant strain of combat. Scars accumulate, some visible, some buried. With each contract completed, each battlefield survived, he reinforces the identity that the world has pushed him toward. Lone fighter, drifter, blade for hire. But beneath that hardened exterior, something fragile still exists. It shows itself in quiet moments when he watches other soldiers laugh around a fire and does not join. When he notices camaraderie, but refuses to reach toward it. When he hears the word brother used casually among men who have fought together for years. And something in him tightens. He does not hate connection. He fears its cost. The rain-soaked night of Gambino's death taught him a lesson that feels irrefutable. Attachment invites devastation. Better to leave before you are left. Better to walk alone than to be driven out. This self-imposed isolation becomes armor. And like all armor, it protects while also constricting. The more he defines himself through solitude, the more difficult it becomes to imagine an alternative. His identity narrows into survival and strength. The idea of a dream, of purpose beyond the next contract, does not yet exist for him. He lives forward in increments of necessity. And yet, fate is not finished with him, because wandering, for all its emptiness, eventually leads to encounter. Somewhere ahead waits a battlefield that will change everything. A white-haired commander with eyes fixed on a distant kingdom. A band of soldiers who fight not only for coin, but for something resembling ambition. But before that meeting, before the band of the hawk reshapes his trajectory, there is this stretch of quiet endurance. A boy who killed his father, a soldier without allegiance, a blade moving through the world with no anchor. The first act of isolation does not make Guts weaker. It makes him harder. And hardness, in the world of Berserk, is both shield and curse. When Guts first encountered Griffith, it did not feel like destiny. It felt like interruption. Another battlefield, another contract, another exchange of steel beneath a sky that did not care who won. Guts fought the way he always fought, direct, relentless, singular. He had no banner, no loyalty beyond survival. And then there was Griffith, composed where others were frantic, deliberate where others were reactive, fighting not merely to survive, but to advance something unseen. Their first duel was not just a clash of blades. It was a collision of worldview zoos. Griffith did not fight like a mercenary. He fought like someone who already saw beyond the present moment. His movements were precise, efficient, almost elegant in their control. When he defeated Guts, it was not humiliation that lingered. It was curiosity. Griffith did not kill him. He claimed him. "I own you." The words could have echoed like chains, but they did not land that way. For perhaps the first time in his life, Guts felt seen not as a burden or a curse, but as potential. Griffith did not fear him, did not accuse him, did not reduce him to superstition. He saw strength and decided it belonged beside him. And Guts, exhausted from wandering without direction, followed. The band of the Hawk was different from every mercenary group Guts had known. There was ambition here, not just hunger for coin, but hunger for ascension. Griffith spoke of a kingdom not as fantasy, but as inevitability. The hawks did not drift from battlefield to battlefield without purpose. Each engagement was a step. Each victory was currency toward a larger design. For the first time, Guts was not fighting merely to survive the day. He was fighting as part of something building. Belonging crept in quietly. It did not arrive in declarations or ceremonies. It came through repetition, through shared meals, through coordinated formations in battle, through laughter that was not forced by drink, but earned through relief. The hawks bled together, and in bleeding together, trust formed. Not the fragile, transactional trust of mercenaries, but something closer to camaraderie. Guts did not know how to accept this at first. He remained guarded. He fought harder than anyone, perhaps as if to justify the space he occupied. But slowly, almost against his will, he began to settle into the rhythm of the group. Casca challenged him openly. Judeau treated him with quiet understanding. Pippin stood like a silent wall of reliability. Rickert looked at him, not with suspicion, but admiration. These small interactions accumulated, and without realizing it, Guts began to feel something he had never allowed himself before. Stability. It was subtle. A shift in the way he slept. A slight easing of the tension in his shoulders around the campfire. The absence of constant anticipation that someone would turn on him overnight. He began to fight, not just beside the hawks, but for them, to protect the formation, to guard Griffith's flank, to trust that someone would guard his. This was new territory, and at the center of it all stood Griffith. Griffith was not merely a commander. He was gravity. The hawks orbited him because he radiated certainty. His dream to obtain his own kingdom was audacious, almost absurd given his origins. But he spoke of it with such clarity that it felt less like ambition and more like prophecy. To stand near Griffith was to feel pulled toward a horizon you had never considered before. For Guts, who had never possessed a dream beyond the next survival, this was intoxicating. Not because he suddenly adopted Griffith's vision as his own, but because being near someone who believed in something so fiercely awakened a question inside him: what would it mean to live for more than endurance? This question did not surface immediately in words. It simmered. It flickered during victories. It echoed faintly when the hawks celebrated promotions within Midland's army. It whispered when nobles who once sneered at mercenaries began to treat the hawks with wary respect. For a boy born beneath a corpse, raised as expendable, wandering without root, this ascent was surreal. He had comrades. He had recognition. He had a place in a structure that was not built on fear. And then there was Casca. Their relationship did not begin gently. It began with friction, with resentment, with mutual assessment. Casca saw in Guts a threat to her position at Griffith's side. Guts saw in Casca a soldier who measured loyalty differently than he did. But friction when sustained long enough, can generate understanding. On the battlefield, they learned each other's rhythms. In quiet moments, they glimpsed vulnerability. Casca had devoted herself entirely to Griffith's dream. Guts had never devoted himself to anything beyond survival. Through her, he began to see what devotion looked like when it was chosen rather than imposed. And through him, she began to see strength that did not originate in worship, but in self-reliance. The golden age of the Band of the Hawk is luminous not because it is perfect, but because it contrasts so violently with what came before. Guts experiences something dangerously precious, something to lose. He laughs more. He trains not just to survive, but to improve. He watches Griffith's victories with pride rather than calculation. He fights, knowing someone will pull him back if he falls too far forward. The boy who ran into the forest alone after killing Gambino now rides at the head of an army. But beneath the victories and celebrations, something delicate forms: attachment. And attachment, for someone like Guts, is both miracle and risk. Because the world that shaped him has never allowed him to keep what he loves for long. Still, during these years, that fear fades into the background. He allows himself to believe, perhaps unconsciously, that this time might be different. That perhaps he has finally outrun the pattern of abandonment and betrayal. That perhaps belonging can last. The hawks rise. Battles are won. Titles are granted. The future looks expansive rather than suffocating. For the first time since his birth beneath the gallows tree, Guts does not feel defined by survival alone. He feels part of something greater. And that is what will make the fall unbearable. The golden age did not shatter all at once. It cracked quietly, almost invisibly, in a moment that seemed insignificant at the time. No battlefield, no betrayal, no drawn swords, just a fountain, a quiet night, and Griffith speaking to a princess about what it means to call someone a friend. Guts was not meant to hear that conversation. He stood at a distance, half in shadow, listening without intending to. Griffith's voice was calm, composed, reflective in a way it rarely was in the presence of his soldiers. And what he said that night would alter the trajectory of Guts's life more than any battle ever could. A true friend, Griffith said, is someone who has his own dream, someone who stands as my equal, someone who would oppose me if necessary. The words were not cruel. They were not meant as dismissal. Griffith spoke them almost philosophically, as if defining a concept rather than drawing a boundary. But to Guts, standing there in the dark, they landed with a quiet finality. Equal. The word echoed. Until that moment, Guts had never consciously questioned his place beside Griffith. He fought at his side, bled at his side, risked his life without hesitation. Griffith had claimed him, trusted him, relied on him. Their bond felt unspoken, but undeniable. And yet, listening to that definition, Guts realized something that unsettled him deeply. He did not have a dream of his own. He had been living inside Griffith's. For the first time since joining the Hawks, a sense of imbalance crept into his thoughts. Was he merely a sword in Griffith's hand? A tool, elevated perhaps, respected perhaps, but ultimately existing in service of another man's ambition? Griffith's dream was vast and luminous, a kingdom carved from impossible odds. But Guts's dream? It had never been articulated. He had fought because fighting was what he knew. He had stayed because staying felt right. But had he ever chosen a direction for himself? The question did not wound immediately. It lingered. It followed him through drills, through strategy meetings, through quiet nights around the fire. The Hawks saw him as Griffith's right hand, as his strongest warrior, as the man who could shift the tide of a battle through sheer force of will. But Griffith's words reframed that position in a way Guts could not ignore. If equality required a dream, then what was he? For someone who had grown up fighting merely to survive, the concept of a personal dream felt abstract, almost indulgent. Survival had been his only objective for so long that imagining something beyond it felt unnatural. And yet, now that he had tasted belonging, tasted purpose within a larger narrative, the absence of his own independent direction began to feel suffocating. It was not resentment that grew inside him. It was restlessness. Griffith, for all his brilliance and charisma, had always stood slightly above the Hawks. They followed him because he moved with certainty, because he seemed untouched by doubt. But in defining friendship the way he did, he unintentionally revealed the hierarchy beneath the camaraderie. Griffith would not accept someone as equal unless that person walked their own path. And Guts realized he was not walking a path. He was walking beside Griffith's. The irony is devastating in hindsight. Griffith admired strength above all else. He valued independence. He sought individuals who could stand beside him without being swallowed by his ambition. And Guts, who embodied raw strength more than anyone else in the Hawks, suddenly understood that he had tethered himself too tightly to another man's vision. That understanding did not diminish his loyalty. It complicated it. There is a quiet tragedy in the way Guts comes to this realization. He does not confront Griffith angrily. He does not accuse him of condescension. He internalizes the standard Griffith has set and measures himself against it. And in doing so, he reaches a painful conclusion. If he wishes to stand beside Griffith as an equal, as a true friend, he must first discover who he is outside of him. This is not rebellion. It is aspiration. For perhaps the first time in his life, Guts desires something that is not imposed by circumstance. He wants agency, not survival, not borrowed ambition. His own. The decision to leave the band of the Hawk is not impulsive. It builds slowly, layer by layer, until it becomes unavoidable. He understands the risk. He understands what he might lose. But staying without discovering himself would mean remaining perpetually in someone else's shadow, even if that shadow is cast by brilliance. When he finally tells Griffith he is leaving, the moment is charged not with hatred, but inevitability. Griffith challenges him to a duel, not out of rage, at least not visibly, but because Griffith cannot accept departure without contest. The first time they fought, Griffith claimed him. This time, Guts fights for himself, and he wins. The victory is quiet, but seismic. The blade that once felt too heavy in his childhood now moves with mastery. Griffith, the untouchable commander, falls. But instead of triumph, what follows is fracture. Guts does not see it immediately. He rides away, believing he has done something necessary, something honest. He believes that in leaving, he is honoring Griffith's own definition of equality. He believes that one day he may return not as a subordinate, but as someone who stands on his own foundation. What he does not see is the devastation this departure inflicts on Griffith. For Griffith, who built his life on control, on ascent, on unbroken forward motion, Guts was not merely a soldier. He was anchor, emotional axis. Perhaps the only person whose presence disrupted Griffith's otherwise flawless composure. When Guts leaves, something destabilizes. And in that destabilization lies the seed of catastrophe. But from Guts' perspective, the choice feels pure. He is not running from belonging this time. He is stepping toward self-definition. For the first time since he was born, beneath that swaying corpse, he is not reacting to the world. He is choosing. And that choice, born from the desire to stand as an equal rather than an extension, will echo into the darkest night of his life. Because sometimes the pursuit of identity triggers consequences no one is prepared to endure. When Guts left the band of the Hawk, he believed he was stepping toward something, toward identity, toward equality, toward the kind of self-determined existence Griffith himself had defined as worthy. What he did not realize was that his absence would create a void large enough to swallow everything they had built. Griffith's arrest, torture, and fall from grace unfolded in his absence like a kingdom rotting from within. And when Guts returned, it was not to celebration, not to stability, but to ruin. Griffith was no longer the untouchable commander with eyes fixed on a distant throne. He was broken, his body mutilated, his tongue cut, his tendons severed. His dream, once luminous and invincible, reduced to something fragile and suffocating. The Hawks, once rising stars in Midland's army, were now fugitives, hunted, scattered, clinging to survival in forests and caves. Guts had wanted to find himself. Instead, he returned to devastation. The rescue of Griffith was desperate but successful. The Hawks bled for him, risked everything for him. And when they finally escaped with his broken body, there was a brief, fragile hope that something could be salvaged. That perhaps Griffith, though damaged, would still lead them in some capacity. That perhaps the dream could be reshaped. But the dream had not merely been wounded. It had been erased. Griffith, once defined by control and beauty, now existed inside a body that would never again wield a sword or command an army. His identity, built entirely around ascent, had nowhere to go. And when he overheard Casca and Guts speaking quietly about their future together, about leaving the battlefield behind, something inside him collapsed completely. Griffith had lost his kingdom, and now he was losing Guts. That night, beneath a crimson sky, the Behelit activated. It is important to understand the weight of that moment. The Behelit had always been an object of mystery, grotesque, unsettling, its face shifting subtly as if alive. But until that night, it had remained dormant, a curiosity, a talisman without visible function. When Griffith held it in despair, when blood from his broken body touched its surface, causality aligned. The world tore open. The sky darkened unnaturally. The landscape twisted. The band of the hawk was transported into something beyond comprehension. A realm not governed by human law, but by something older, colder, more absolute. The Eclipse. The hawks stood suspended in a dimension of writhing flesh and monumental stone faces. The god hand descending like deities carved from cruelty itself. Void, Slan, Ubik, Conrad. And above all, the presence of something vast and incomprehensible guiding the moment toward inevitability. Griffith was offered a choice: to abandon his humanity, to sacrifice the band of the hawk. Every man and woman who had fought for him, believed in him, loved him, in exchange for the fulfillment of his dream. The temptation was not framed as evil. It was framed as destiny. The God hand spoke of causality, of preordained suffering, of a path that had always been leading to this moment. They reframed Griffith's pain, not as tragedy, but as necessary steps toward transcendence. His torture, his humiliation, his despair, all components of a grand design that required only one final act: sacrifice. And Griffith, broken beyond recognition, whispered yes. What followed was not a battle. It was annihilation. The hawks were branded as offerings. Apostles descended, grotesque, monstrous beings driven by appetite and cruelty, tearing through the soldiers who had once ridden proudly beneath a banner of a hawk. Screams filled the warped air. Blood soaked the ground. Men who had survived countless wars were reduced to prey in minutes. Guts fought like something possessed. He cut down apostles with desperate fury, trying to reach Griffith, trying to reach Casca, trying to make sense of a nightmare that refused logic. But the scale of the horror dwarfed him. This was not a battlefield governed by strength or strategy. It was ritual. and he was outmatched by design. When Griffith was reborn as Femto, no longer human, no longer bound by the vulnerabilities that had once defined him, the final betrayal unfolded in the most intimate, devastating way possible. Before Guts's eyes, powerless and restrained, Femto violated Casca. It was not merely an act of cruelty. It was erasure. It was the destruction of something sacred in front of the only person who would understand its weight. Guts's rage in that moment transcended language. It was primal, animal. He tore against his restraints with such force that he severed his own arm in the attempt to reach them. He lost an eye to an apostle's claw. He screamed until his voice broke. But none of it changed the outcome. The Eclipse was not designed for resistance. It was designed for inevitability. When the ritual concluded, when the apostles finished feasting, when the dimension began to collapse back into the human world, only 2 members of the Band of the Hawk remained alive: Guts and Casca. Marked, branded, cursed to exist as sacrifices, attracting demons and spirits for the rest of their lives. Everything else was gone. Judo, Pippin, Corcus. The soldiers who had laughed around campfires, who had celebrated victories, who had believed in a shared future, erased in one night of cosmic cruelty. Guts emerged from the Eclipse not as the man who had left to find himself, but as something fractured beyond repair. He had sought equality. He had sought independence. And in doing so, he had unknowingly triggered a chain of events that culminated in the massacre of everyone he cared about. This is where his suffering transforms. Before the Eclipse, his pain was personal. Abandonment, betrayal, identity. After the Eclipse, his pain becomes mythic, cosmic. He is no longer simply a man navigating hardship. He is a survivor of something that should have killed him, a witness to divinity stripped of mercy. And perhaps the cruelest aspect of it all is this: he lived. He survived again, born beneath a corpse, and lived, hunted by mercenaries, and lived, sacrificed in a ritual meant to erase him, and lived. Survival, once his quiet defiance, now feels like punishment. Because living means remembering. Living means carrying the image of Griffith's transformation. Living means carrying Casca's broken mind in his arms as she wakes into madness, unable to process the horror. Living means knowing that the man he once called friend chose godhood over them all. The Eclipse does not end Guts. It refines his suffering into something sharper. And from that sharpened pain, a new version of him will rise. Not a wanderer, not a hawk, but something darker. The Black Swordsman. When Guts emerged from the Eclipse, he did not emerge as a man seeking healing. He emerged as a man hollowed out and set ablaze from the inside. Survival had once been his defiance. Now it felt like condemnation. He had lived through the annihilation of the Band of the Hawk. He had watched Griffith shed his humanity like old skin. He had failed to protect Casca in the one moment that mattered more than all the battles he had ever won combined. And in the aftermath, with the brand of sacrifice carved into his neck, he understood something terrifyingly simple. The nightmare was not over. It would follow him. It would stalk him. It would bleed into every night for the rest of his life. The brand did not merely mark him as prey. It ensured he would never again know peace. Spirits clawed at him in the dark. Apostles sensed him across distances like sharks scenting blood in water. Sleep became a battleground of its own. Every dusk carried the threat of intrusion. Every shadow felt animate. The world had always been cruel, but now it was openly hostile. The thin veil separating humanity from monstrosity had been ripped away, and Guts could no longer pretend he was fighting ordinary wars. In the earliest days after the eclipse, he stayed with Casca, and there is a quiet, painful tenderness in that period that is often overshadowed by what follows. Casca's mind had fractured under the weight of what Femto had done to her. She could not recognize him consistently. She could not speak coherently. She existed in a state of terrified regression, as if her psyche had fled to childhood to escape what it had witnessed. Guts, who had already lost everything, found himself holding the last living connection to the Hawks in his arms, and she no longer knew who he was. He tried, at first, to protect her and fight at the same time. He tried to balance vengeance with responsibility, but the brand bled constantly, drawing horrors to them night after night. Casca, in her fragile state, could not defend herself. Every encounter became more dangerous. Every delay in action felt like cowardice. And inside Guts, rage was fermenting into something corrosive. It whispered that Griffith still existed, that the man who had sacrificed them now walked the world as something divine. That justice had not been served. The decision to leave Casca in Godot's care was not born of indifference. It was born of obsession. Guts convinced himself that the only way to protect her in the long term was to hunt down the source of everything, to kill apostles, to carve a path toward Griffith, to make the world bleed in proportion to what had been taken from him. He told himself that vengeance was protection, that slaughter was strategy, that if he could just destroy enough of the darkness, he might carve out a future where Casca could exist without terror. But vengeance has a way of reshaping the one who carries it. Thus began the era of the Black Swordsman. He armed himself not merely with a blade, but with an identity constructed entirely around destruction. The Dragon Slayer, an absurdly massive slab of iron that no normal man should have been able to wield, became less a weapon and more a declaration. If the world had escalated into demons and gods, then he would escalate in return. He would become something equally monstrous in scale. He would answer horror with overwhelming force. In taverns and villages, rumors spread of a lone warrior clad in black, carrying a sword too large to be called practical. He hunted apostles not with noble speeches or grand strategy, but with brutal efficiency. He allowed himself to be swallowed by rage in battle. He endured wounds that would cripple other men. He fought through broken bones, through blood loss, through exhaustion that bordered on madness. And when the fighting stopped, he did not celebrate. He did not linger. He moved on to the next target. There is something deeply tragic about this phase of his life, because on the surface, it looks like empowerment. Guts is stronger than ever, deadlier than ever. He faces monsters without flinching. He wins battles that should be unwinnable. But beneath that strength lies erosion. Each apostle he kills brings a fleeting sense of satisfaction, but never closure. Each victory is followed by the same emptiness. Griffith remains untouchable, elevated beyond reach, and so the killing continues. Not because it brings peace, but because stopping would mean confronting the silence underneath the rage. The Black Swordsman persona is armor of a different kind. In his youth, he learned to harden himself to survive betrayal. Now he hardens himself to survive grief. Compassion becomes dangerous. Vulnerability becomes impractical. When people attempt to approach him, when they see something human behind the scars, he pushes them away, sometimes cruelly, sometimes deliberately. It is easier to be feared than to be known. And yet, despite all of this self-imposed isolation, cracks begin to show. Puck, the small elf who attaches himself to Guts early in this period, becomes an unexpected mirror. Where Guts is heavy, Puck is light. Where Guts is silent, Puck chatters. And while Guts often dismisses him, there are moments, small, almost imperceptible, where that presence interrupts the spiral. It reminds him, however faintly, that the world is not composed entirely of cruelty. But he resists that reminder, because to soften would be to feel fully. And to feel fully would mean confronting the scale of what he lost. The most disturbing aspect of the Black Swordsman era is not the violence itself. It is the way Guts begins to resemble the very monsters he hunts. His eyes grow colder. His tolerance for collateral damage shrinks. There are moments where civilians fear him more than the apostles. And in those moments, you can sense the internal tension building. He is fighting demons externally, while risking becoming one internally. The brand never stops bleeding. The nights never grow quiet. The memory of the eclipse never dulls. Griffith's face, calm, transcendent, inhuman, lingers at the edge of every thought. Revenge becomes the axis around which his existence rotates. It gives him direction, yes, but it also narrows his world into a tunnel with only one visible endpoint. And perhaps the cruelest irony is this. In trying to destroy Griffith, Guts is walking a path that Griffith once walked, single-minded, willing to sacrifice everything for a singular objective. The difference is that Guts sacrifices himself. He sacrifices rest. He sacrifices companionship. He sacrifices any possibility of healing. He chooses suffering deliberately because it feels deserved. Because surviving the eclipse, when so many others did not, leaves a residue of guilt he cannot articulate. The Black Swordsman is not just a hunter of apostles. He is a man punishing himself through perpetual war. And the longer he walks that path alone, the closer he comes to losing whatever remains of the boy who once dared to seek a dream of his own. The Black Swordsman walked alone because he believed solitude was strength. He told himself that attachments were liabilities, that caring for others would only slow his blade and dull his focus. Revenge demanded efficiency. Efficiency demanded detachment. But the world, stubborn and unpredictable, refused to let him remain alone forever. Companions did not arrive as grand saviors or dramatic equals. They arrived inconveniently, awkwardly, persistently, and in doing so, they forced Guts to confront a truth he had spent years avoiding. Isolation was not protecting him. It was hollowing him out. Puck was the first disruption, small and luminous, and utterly incompatible with the darkness Guts wrapped around himself. The elf followed him, not because of ambition or fear, but because he sensed something wounded beneath the armor. Guts dismissed him repeatedly, insulted him, ignored him. And yet, Puck stayed. That persistence created a fracture in Guts' carefully maintained solitude. It was difficult to fully surrender to hatred when someone so relentlessly light refused to treat him like a monster. The presence was subtle, almost comedic at times, but it introduced a counterweight to the abyss, pulling at him. Then came others, not warriors of legendary renown, but individuals who, for reasons of their own, began orbiting his path. Farnese, whose faith had once manifested as fanatic cruelty, encountered Guts as something she could neither categorize nor control. Sir Pico, composed and observant, recognized both the danger and depth in him. Isidro, reckless and eager, saw not a broken man, but an ideal, the embodiment of strength he wished to become. And later, Shirka, with quiet perception far beyond her years, looked directly into the spiritual maelstrom surrounding Guts and understood the scale of what he carried. None of them were invited. None of them were welcomed. But they stayed. At first, Guts treated their presence as temporary. He fought ahead of them, positioning himself between danger and the group, not out of affection, but out of habit. Protecting others had once been instinct during the Hawks campaigns. That instinct, though buried beneath layers of rage, had not vanished entirely. It resurfaced in flashes, a defensive swing angled slightly wider to shield someone behind him. A sharp command barked to to prevent someone from stepping into a fatal blind spot. These gestures were practical on the surface, but they revealed something deeper. Despite everything, he still could not abandon others to die if he could prevent it. This is the quiet transformation of this era. Guts does not suddenly become gentle. He does not shed his fury, but he begins, almost unwillingly, to function within a group again. And that reintroduction to companionship is terrifying in a way no apostle ever was. Fighting monsters is simple. Letting people stand close enough to be hurt is not. The nights remain brutal. The brand continues to draw horrors. Spirits claw at the edges of campfires. Apostles test their defenses. But now, Guts is not facing the darkness alone. And that shared struggle reawakens memories he had tried to bury. Memories of the Hawks standing shoulder to shoulder, of coordinated battle cries, of trust forged through repetition. Every time someone survives because of his strength, he feels something dangerously close to purpose again. Not vengeance, not obsession, something steadier. Yet this shift is not smooth. There are moments when the beast of darkness, the manifestation of his trauma and fury, whispers in the recesses of his mind. It tempts him toward total surrender to rage, urging him to cast aside the weak, to prioritize only the kill, to abandon empathy entirely. The beast promises simplicity. It promises relief from guilt and restraint. And in moments of exhaustion, when blood loss blurs his vision and the world feels hostile beyond reason, that promise is seductive. What restrains him is not moral purity. It is presence. When he sees fear in Isidro's eyes, when he hears Farnese's breath catch at the sight of something monstrous, when Shierka reaches into the astral plane to pull him back from psychological collapse, he is reminded, forcefully, that his choices ripple outward. He is no longer a solitary blade carving a private path of destruction. He is part of a fragile formation again. His fall would not only end him, it would shatter those behind him. And perhaps the most significant shift occurs in his evolving relationship with Casca. Though her mind remains fractured for much of this journey, his objective gradually pivots. Revenge no longer stands alone at the center of his existence. Protecting Casca, restoring her, becomes equally, if not more, important. This is a monumental change. It means his path is no longer aimed solely at Griffith's throat. It is aimed toward healing, however distant that possibility may seem. This duality creates tension inside him. Part of him still burns for retribution. Part of him longs for confrontation, for an answer to the cosmic injustice of the Eclipse. But another part, quieter and more fragile, wants something radically different. A world in which Casca can exist without fear, where nights do not drip with blood, where the brand does not dictate every movement. Companionship complicates hatred. It introduces alternatives. As the group travels through landscapes warped by the merging of the physical and astral worlds, Guts finds himself fighting not just for survival, or revenge, but for passage, for safe routes, for intact camps, for the continuation of a journey that involves others' dreams, as well as his own. That shared journey gradually reshapes him in ways he does not consciously acknowledge. His commands become less harsh, his silences less absolute. He begins, in fleeting moments, to listen rather than simply endure. The tragedy of Guts has always been that every time he finds something worth protecting, the universe tests his right to keep it. Companionship, therefore, feels precarious, like glass balanced on the edge of a cliff. But instead of rejecting it outright, as he once would have, he allows it to exist. He allows people to walk beside him. And in doing so, he risks once more the pain of loss. This is growth, but it is not comfortable growth. It is jagged, reluctant, fought for inch by inch. The Black Swordsman does not vanish overnight. He still swings the Dragon Slayer with terrifying force. He still glares at the horizon with unresolved fury. But the path beneath his feet is no longer carved solely by rage. It is carved by shared survival. And that changes everything. Because once you begin fighting for others again, revenge is no longer the only destination. As Guts continues forward with companions at his side, the battles grow more violent, more unnatural, more cosmic in scale. The merging of the astral and physical worlds has reshaped reality itself. Monsters no longer hide at the edges of civilization. They roam openly. Apostles command territories like feudal lords of nightmare. The world Griffith helped create after his rebirth is beautiful on the surface, unified under Falconia's radiant promise, yet beneath it churns something deeply unsettling. And in the midst of this shifting world, Guts is forced to confront a truth he has been outrunning since the Eclipse. His body and mind are not infinite resources. Every fight costs him more than it used to. His scars are layered over older scars. Bones once broken ache before storms. The brand bleeds constantly, sapping sleep and clarity. There are moments mid-battle where his vision narrows, where blood loss threatens to drag him into unconsciousness, even as he continues swinging the Dragon Slayer with enough force to cleave monsters in half. The human body has limits. Guts has been exceeding them for years. And in those moments of extremity, the beast of darkness grows louder. The beast is not a literal creature stalking the woods. It is the embodiment of Guts' trauma, his rage, his guilt, his suppressed grief, his self-hatred. It speaks in whispers that grow sharper during weakness. It reminds him of the Eclipse. It reminds him of Casca's screams. It asks him why he bothers protecting anyone when everything he touches is eventually destroyed. It tempts him toward surrender. Not surrender to death, but surrender to pure violence. To abandon restraint entirely. To become something that does not hesitate. The terrifying part is that the beast does not lie. It points to patterns, It highlights his failures. It frames his suffering as evidence that compassion is futile. And when exhaustion strips away his defenses, its logic becomes dangerously persuasive. The beast promises simplicity. If he embraces it fully, he will not feel guilt. He will not feel fear. He will not feel the fragile ache of attachment. He will exist only as destruction directed outward. But what would remain of him then? This question becomes urgent when Guts encounters the Berserker armor. Forged by dwarven hands and steeped in ancient power, the armor offers something both miraculous and horrifying. It removes the body's natural limiters. Pain becomes distant. Broken bones are forced into alignment through sheer pressure. Muscles are driven past the point of tearing. The wearer can continue fighting long after any ordinary human would collapse. For someone like Guts, perpetually outnumbered, perpetually outmatched by supernatural entities, it feels like a necessary escalation. If the world demands monsters, he will become one. The first time he dons the armor, the transformation is immediate and brutal. His movements become feral, faster, less calculated. The dragon slayer swings with reckless abandon. Apostles that once required strategy are torn apart through sheer overwhelming force. To his enemies, he becomes something mythic, a black beast wreathed in violence. But inside the helmet, something fractures. The armor does not simply amplify strength. It erodes identity. It feeds on rage, on instinct, on the very impulses the beast of darkness has been nurturing. In its embrace, Guts feels the intoxicating absence of pain, the narrowing of focus into pure kill or be killed clarity. There is no doubt, no hesitation, only action. It is relief. And that relief is what makes it dangerous. Because pain, as brutal as it is, anchors him to his humanity. Pain reminds him of consequences. Pain forces him to recognize his body as something vulnerable and finite. The Berserker armor strips that away. It allows him to continue fighting even as bones shatter, even as blood drains, even as his mind begins to splinter under the strain. There are moments where he loses awareness entirely, where friend and foe blur at the edges of his perception. In those moments, it is not his will guiding the blade. It is the beast, exultant, unleashed. Without intervention, he would tear through everything in reach. Companion or enemy would make little difference. And this is where the significance of those companions crystallizes. Shirka, with her connection to the astral plane, becomes his anchor. She enters the darkness of his mind during these episodes, confronting the beast directly, guiding him back toward himself before the armor consumes him entirely. It is an intimate and terrifying act, witnessing the landscape of his trauma not as metaphor, but as tangible psychic terrain. She sees the chains wrapped around his heart. She sees the eclipse etched into his subconscious, like an open wound that never closed. Without her, the armor would devour him. Without the group, there would be no one to pull him back from the edge. This dynamic reframes strength in a way Guts once would have rejected. He has always equated reliance with weakness. But the Berserker armor proves something undeniable. Alone, he would destroy himself. His survival now depends not solely on endurance, but on trust, on allowing others to intervene when he crosses the threshold into something inhuman. There is profound irony here. The boy born beneath a corpse survived by trusting no one. The Black Swordsman survived by isolating himself. But the warrior clad in the Berserker armor survives only because others refuse to let him vanish inside it. The armor represents both empowerment and self-annihilation. It allows him to stand against threats that would otherwise be impossible to defeat. It keeps his companions alive in moments where ordinary strength would fail. Yet each use extracts a cost. His senses dull slightly. His body accumulates damage that even forced alignment cannot erase. His vision dims at the edges. There are hints that if he continues long enough, he may lose the ability to distinguish reality from rage entirely. The beast of darkness does not need to win outright. It only needs patience. And so, Guts walks a razor's edge. Every battle becomes a negotiation between necessity and identity. How much of himself can he sacrifice in order to protect the people walking beside him? How close can he step toward monstrosity before he cannot return? The tragedy is that he would sacrifice everything without hesitation if it meant ensuring Casca's safety. He would accept blindness. He would accept madness. He would accept death. The armor becomes an external manifestation of that willingness, a tool that says, I will endure any consequence. But endurance is not infinite. The more he leans on the armor, the more urgent the central question becomes. Is he fighting to preserve a future, or is he accelerating toward a final collapse? The beast whispers that collapse would be easier. Shirka's voice, faint but steady, insists otherwise. And somewhere between those opposing forces, Guts continues walking forward, not unbroken, not stable, but still choosing, battle after battle, to return to himself. For now, by the time Guts and his companions begin to hear whispers of Falconia, the world has already shifted into something unrecognizable. The merging of the astral and physical realms has not only unleashed horrors, it has also created opportunity. Kingdoms have fallen. Borders have dissolved. Entire regions have been swallowed by creatures that once existed only in myth. Humanity, terrified and fragmented, begins gravitating toward a single beacon rising from the chaos. A gleaming city built around the promise of safety, unity, and divine leadership. At its center stands Griffith, reborn as Femto during the Eclipse and later incarnated physically into the world once more. Griffith does not rule through visible tyranny. He rules through salvation. He appears where calamity strikes. He defeats monstrous threats with calm, impossible grace. He unites armies that once warred against each other. He offers structure where there was none. To the people, he is not a demon. He is a savior. a hawk of light, descending upon a broken world to gather the lost beneath his wings. Falconia rises like a dream fulfilled. Tall white spires pierce the sky. Refugees flood its gates, seeking protection from the monsters roaming the wilds. Trade routes stabilize under his banner. Apostles, once feral predators, now serve as generals in disciplined formations. It is horrifying and magnificent at once. The world that once seemed destined for total collapse is reorganizing itself around Griffith's vision. And this is what makes it unbearable. For Guts, Griffith is not a messiah. He is the man who chose grindhood over friendship, the architect of the Eclipse, the one who violated Casca and sacrificed the Band of the Hawk without hesitation. Every time Griffith's name is spoken with reverence, it reopens a wound that has never scabbed over. Every story of his heroism feels like a distortion of reality, as if the world has collectively agreed to forget the cost of his ascension. The cruelty is not loud. It is quiet and pervasive. Guts witnesses villages praising Griffith as humanity's shield. He hears soldiers speak of him with devotion that borders on worship. He sees banners bearing the hawk symbol, a symbol that once meant camaraderie and shared struggle, now rebranded as divine insignia. The Golden Age, once intimate and human, has been transformed into legend, polished and rewritten. And in that rewriting, Guts is erased. There is a profound isolation in watching the person who destroyed your world become the savior of everyone else's. Revenge once felt straightforward. Kill the apostles. Find Griffith. End him. But Falconia complicates everything. Griffith is no longer merely a transcendent demon. He is the foundation of humanity's last stable refuge. To strike at him would not only be personal vengeance, it would destabilize the fragile order holding back total annihilation. This is the moral labyrinth Guts finds himself trapped inside. Does Griffith's salvation of the many justify the sacrifice of the few? Is a kingdom built on betrayal still worthy of standing? Can something born from absolute cruelty produce genuine good? These are not questions Guts once would have entertained. During the Black Swordsman era, the objective was singular. Now, confronted with Falconia's undeniable stability, certainty fractures, and yet the personal wound remains unchanged. Griffith's presence in the world is not abstract. He exists physically again. He walks among his followers. He commands armies. He looks almost identical to the man Guts once followed. Beautiful, composed, unreachable. But there is something distant in him now, something untethered from ordinary emotion. His gaze holds calculation without warmth. His smile reassures masses, but reveals nothing of the boy who once stood beneath a fountain, speaking about dreams. When Guts finally glimpses him again from afar, the reaction is not explosive. It is heavy. Years of rage do not vanish. but they are joined by something colder. The recognition that Griffith has achieved exactly what he set out to achieve. A kingdom, reverence, legacy. The dream realized. The cost, unbearable to Guts, seems irrelevant to the world at large. There is a particular cruelty in that success, because it forces Guts to confront the possibility that the universe rewarded Griffith's sacrifice, that the God Hand's promise was not hollow. That causality did, in fact, bend toward this outcome. The eclipse was not chaos. It was construction, but construction built on bones. As Falconia thrives, the divide between Guts and Griffith becomes more philosophical than physical. Griffith has transcended the human condition. He operates on a scale that reframes individual suffering as acceptable collateral. Guts, despite everything, remains stubbornly human. His motivations are personal. His grief is intimate. His loyalty, though scarred, is real. This contrast sharpens the tragedy of their relationship. They once stood side by side as soldiers rising through ranks together. Now one stands above humanity, and the other remains among it, scarred, bleeding, defiant. And yet, even within Falconia's radiance, there are hints that perfection is an illusion. The apostles serving Griffith are not redeemed. They are controlled. The city's stability relies on power structures few understand. The God Hand's influence has not vanished. It lingers, unseen, but present. Falconia may be safe, but it is not innocent. For Guts, this means the story is not over. His journey gradually shifts from pure revenge toward something more complex. Protecting Casca, preserving his companions, navigating a world reshaped by forces beyond ordinary comprehension. Griffith stands at the center of that world, luminous and untouchable. But Guts no longer moves with blind fury toward him. He moves with caution, with awareness that striking recklessly could unleash consequences greater than his own pain. This is a different kind of suffering. Not the immediate horror of the eclipse, not the raw violence of the Black Swordsman era, but the slow, grinding tension of living in a world where your greatest trauma has been reframed as divine necessity. Falconia shines, and somewhere beyond its walls, Guts continues walking, not toward glory, not toward public redemption, but toward a confrontation that feels less like destiny and more like inevitability. The hawk of light rules the sky. The Black Swordsman walks the earth, and the distance between them has never felt wider. For years after the eclipse, Casca existed in a state of fragile absence. Her mind, unable to withstand what it had endured, had retreated inward, sealing away memory like a wound stitched too tightly to reopen. To Guts, this fractured version of her was both comfort and torment. She was alive. She breathed. She could be protected, but she was also unreachable, existing behind a veil that no amount of strength or devotion could pierce. He could fight armies. He could challenge apostles. But he could not restore her. And that helplessness was its own quiet suffering. When the journey to Elfhelm finally presents the possibility of healing her mind, it feels almost unreal. After years of bloodshed and wandering, the objective shifts from survival and vengeance to restoration. The island itself, hidden out from the ordinary world and steeped in ancient magic, represents something Guts has not experienced in a long time. Hope without immediate violence. The air is different there. The atmosphere does not thrum with predatory intent. For the first time in years, the brand does not bleed relentlessly. The silence is not ominous, but healing is not a spell cast with a single gesture. Shierka and Farnese descend into Casca's mind in a ritual that reveals the true scale of her trauma. Inside her psyche, the eclipse has not faded. It exists as a shattered landscape of broken dolls and torn memories, a symbolic graveyard of everything she once was. Each fragment of her identity lies buried beneath fear. Each attempt to reassemble her requires confronting the moment Femto destroyed her sense of safety. The imagery is not subtle. It is raw. Casca's mind did not forget the eclipse. It hid it, locked it away in a place so dark that even remembering her own name became impossible. To restore her means reopening that chamber. It means facing the memory rather than suppressing it. And when the final fragment is retrieved, when her identity clicks back into place, the relief is not pure joy. It is terror. Casca awakens fully aware, fully remembering, fully conscious of what was done to her. The first time she looks at Guts after her restoration, there is recognition. But intertwined with that recognition is panic. Because Guts is inseparable from the memory of the eclipse. He was there. He was restrained. He was screaming. He was powerless. And for Casca, whose trauma crystallized around that violation, proximity to him triggers the flood of everything she had locked away. This is the cruel paradox of healing in Berserk. Restoration does not erase pain. It reintroduces it. Guts, who endured years of torment, believing that if he could just bring her back, things would somehow stabilize, is forced to confront an unbearable reality. Saving her mind does not automatically repair their bond. Love cannot overwrite trauma. Devotion cannot silence memory. Casca does not see only the man who protected her for years. She sees the night sky turning red. She hears the apostles. She feels helplessness flooding her body again. And so she recoils, not out of hatred, not out of blame, but out of instinctive terror. For Guts, this moment lands heavier than any wound the dragon slayer ever inflicted upon him. He fought monsters for years, believing there was an end point. An image of Casca whole again, standing beside him. But now that image is fractured. She is whole, yes, self-conscious, yes. But her wholeness includes the trauma. It includes the violation. It includes Griffith. The distance between them becomes emotional rather than physical. This is where Guts' suffering transforms again. It is no longer only about revenge or survival. It becomes about acceptance, about recognizing that some scars do not vanish, even when the mind is restored. He cannot force her comfort. He cannot demand that she separate him from the memory. He must wait. He must endure the silence. He must allow her space to breathe without him. And for someone who has always solved problems through action, waiting is agony. There is also the additional, inescapable presence of Griffith's lingering connection. The child born of Casca's violation, the Moonlight Boy, appears intermittently, gentle and mysterious, tied both to Guts and Griffith in ways that complicate everything. That child represents something neither wholly cursed nor wholly innocent. He is living proof that the Eclipse's consequences extend beyond memory. He is the embodiment of shared fate. When Casca regains herself, she regains awareness of that child too. Nothing is simple. The restoration of her mind does not signal the end of suffering. It signals the beginning of processing it. And processing requires confronting truths that cannot be undone. Griffith still exists. Falconia still stands. The world still worships the man who shattered their lives. Healing does not change that. For Guts, this realization tempers something inside him. The beast of darkness still whispers, but its voice competes now with something steadier. His purpose is no longer singular. It is layered. Protect Casca. Protect the group. Navigate a world reshaped by Griffith's ambition. Decide, eventually, what justice even means in a landscape where good and evil blur under poemic design. There is a quiet, almost unbearable tenderness in the scenes where Guts watches Casca from a distance, careful not to approach too quickly, careful not to trigger the storm in her eyes. He who once charged headlong into battle now measures steps in silence. He learns restraint, not in combat, but in proximity. And perhaps that is a deeper form of strength. The eclipse marked them both, but surviving it requires different battles. Casca fights memory. Guts fights patience. And neither battle has a clear endpoint. If there is one thread that runs unbroken through Guts' entire life, it is not rage, nor vengeance, nor even love. It is continuation. From the moment he was born beneath the corpse of his mother, denied even the dignity of a normal beginning, existence itself became an act of resistance. He was unwanted, then used, then betrayed, then sacrificed. Every phase of his life presented a moment where stopping would have made sense, where lying down would have been understandable, where surrender would have been forgivable. And yet, he continues. This is the quiet defiance at the heart of Berserk. Not that Guts wins every battle, Not that he overcomes every trauma, but that he refuses erasure. In a universe governed by causality, where the God hand speak of destiny as if it were architecture, Guts represents friction. He is the splinter in the machinery, the variable that does not align cleanly with prophecy. He was meant to die in the Eclipse. He did not. He was meant to break entirely under the weight of Casca's suffering. He did not. He was meant to be consumed by the beast of darkness when he first surrendered to the Berserker armor's embrace. He did not. Every time the world narrows to a single unbearable point, he finds some thin, fragile reason to move one step further. That does not make him pure. It does not make him morally unambiguous. Guts has been cruel. He has pushed people away. He has endangered himself recklessly. He has flirted with becoming something monstrous in pursuit of strength. But what separates him from Griffith is not power. It is orientation. Griffith sacrifices others to ascend. Guts sacrifices himself to protect. That distinction matters. As Falconia gleams in the distance, as Griffith stands elevated above humanity, as apostles kneel in disciplined ranks, and refugees sing hymns to the Hawk of Light, Guts does not become louder. He becomes quieter. His struggle is no longer about proving anything to the world. It is about preserving something fragile within it. A circle of companions, a restored Casca finding her footing, a child who exists between curse and innocence. The world calls Griffith its savior. The world does not know the cost, but Guts does. And that knowledge isolates him in a way deeper than physical solitude ever could. There is an almost unbearable tension in the idea that Griffith's world is, on the surface, better, safer, organized. Humanity survives because of him. This complicates vengeance in ways that simple hatred never anticipated. If killing Griffith would plunge the world back into chaos, what then? If tearing down Falconia means unleashing horrors once more, what does justice look like? These are questions without clean answers. And Berserk never pretends otherwise. Guts stands in a space between cosmic determinism and human will. The God hand frame existence as a chain of inevitabilities, each tragedy feeding into the next like gears in a divine engine. But Guts, through sheer stubborn refusal, introduces unpredictability. His survival after the eclipse was not planned. His resistance to the beast is not scripted. His growing ability to trust again was not engineered by causality. It was chosen. Choice is small in Berserk. It rarely changes the world immediately, but it changes the one who makes it. Each time Guts chooses to lower the Dragon Slayer when unnecessary, he defies the beast. Each time he waits instead of charging forward recklessly for revenge, he defies his own worst impulses. Each time he allows someone to stand beside him, to share the burden, he weakens the isolation that once defined him. This is not flashy growth. It is incremental. painfully incremental. And perhaps that is why it feels real. Guts does not heal in the conventional sense. The Eclipse is not erased. The brand does not vanish. The Berserker armor still waits, hungry for his desperation. Griffith still exists, luminous and untouchable. But Guts evolves in how he carries these realities. The suffering does not disappear. It becomes integrated. It becomes something he walks with, rather than something dragging him backward. There is a particular image that lingers when considering the totality of his journey. Guts standing beneath an open sky, scarred beyond recognition, sword resting against his shoulder, companions positioned not behind him, but beside him. He is still hunted, still marked, still facing a future that promises more confrontation than comfort. But he is no longer alone in the way he once was. That matters, because isolation was always the most corrosive element of his suffering. The physical wounds, brutal as they were, healed. The psychological wounds festered in silence. But companionship, hard-won, reluctant, fragile, acts as counterweight. It does not negate tragedy, but it prevents total collapse. Griffith sought to transcend humanity. Guile clings to it. And that clinging is not weakness. It is the cure of his strength. In the end, Berserk does not offer a clean resolution. It does not promise that Griffith will fall, or that causality will shatter under Guts's blade. What it offers instead is something subtler and arguably more powerful. The image of a man who continues walking forward despite knowing the road may never smooth out. A man who fights not because victory is guaranteed, but because stopping would mean conceding that suffering has the final word. Guts' life is a sequence of catastrophes, but it is also a sequence of refusals. Refusal to die when abandoned as an infant. Refusal to become only a weapon under Gambino. Refusal to accept inferiority beneath Griffith. Refusal to vanish in the Eclipse. Refusal to surrender to the beast. Refusal to abandon Casca. Refusal to let trauma define the entirety of his future. That is why his suffering resonates. Not because it is excessive, though it is. Not because it is relentless, though it often feels that way. But because it mirrors something fundamental about endurance itself. Sometimes survival is not glorious. Sometimes it is ugly, furious, trembling. Sometimes it means carrying scars that never fade and moving anyway. As long as Guts walks, causality is not absolute. As long as he breathes, the God Hand's design contains an anomaly. As long as he lifts the Dragon Slayer, there remains the possibility, however distant, that even a world bent by divine cruelty can be challenged by human will. And so the story does not end with triumph. It ends with continuation. The brand still bleeds at night. The armor still waits in silence. Falconia still shines. Griffith still watches the horizon. And somewhere beneath that same sky, Guts adjusts the weight of his sword, steadies his breath, and takes another step forward. not because he believes the road will be easy, but because he has never done anything else. And he will not begin now.